Hello there, everybody. Welcome to this video. I'm so sorry I wasn't able to be with you yesterday, and I hope you find the time to have a listen to what follows. And I would really genuinely love to be with you on another occasion to discuss your thoughts and feedback. This is intended to be really a conversation, not a presentation, so it's with great regret that I deliver it in this way. Nevertheless, I hope it provides some food for thought. And can be the start of a longer dialogue between us as practitioners in MFL. So my name's Oliver. Delighted to be with you, as it were, today. What I'd like to do in this presentation is do four things. Firstly, think a little bit about the narrative of decline. Why is MFL in decline? And really analyze some of the key reasons that are often presented to that and look at some data behind them. Then I'd like to move on to discuss some other problems and assess the evidence for that. I'd like us to consider the bigger picture as well, the rationale for universal modern foreign languages in British schools. Why do we teach this as a subject? And then, as the title suggests, think about what modern foreign languages could look like in the future. But before we begin, I'd like just to talk a little bit about the relationship between what we do in the classroom and what the outcomes of our teaching are. Now, this is a fairly simplistic flow diagram, and forgive me for this. I know that real life is more complex and more subtle than this, but I think there is some truth in saying that while we talk a lot about pedagogy in languages, and rightly so, we talk about how we can teach and how best to teach and what good practice looks like and what new ideas are out there. That's very, very important and really good, and I also take part in those conversations. I think they're great. And also, that forms a large portion of initial teacher training and PGC programs. But of course, it's really potentially a redundant conversation until if it takes place in a vacuum of curriculum and content, because if what works well, a style of pedagogy to teach one aspect of our subject won't necessarily work well to teach another aspect of our subject or in another school or setting. So there is a link between pedagogy and curriculum, in that pedagogy serves our curriculum and pedagogy is the means by which we deliver our curriculum. Similarly, we can have discussions about what a good or bad curriculum might be, but really until we know how we're assessing that, we can't really determine what a good curriculum would be, because we need to know what our goalposts are. So what for one person might be a fantastic curriculum might not be a fantastic curriculum for another person if they are working towards a different style of assessment. And of course, when we're looking at assessments, or it's not really practitioners that look at assessments when Ofqual give their green light to different exam specifications. What they're looking for, supposedly, is whether or not the specification and the proposed examination meets the learning outcomes and objectives that are laid out by the Department for Education and by Ofqual themselves. So there is a sense of hierarchy there. We have to have clear outcomes. We have to know what we're trying to achieve with a subject in order to be able to design good assessments. Once we've got the assessments in mind, once we know what the goalposts are, that enables us to put in place the appropriate curriculum. And once we know what the curriculum is, then that allows us to design our lessons and plan our teaching and learning. Now, of course, there's many debates in what I just said there, for not least the fact that the assessment determines the curriculum, the tail wags the dog, as it were. And I realize it's not such a simplistic relationship, and I'm sure you'll have sympathies with that. But I think my overall point here is that our pedagogy in the classroom is related, has to be related to what we're trying to achieve in terms of learning outcomes right at the top. So there is that relationship, and I think that's an important relationship to remember in all discussions about modern foreign languages, because different practitioners actually have different views on what we're trying to achieve in the first place with modern languages, and we'll come to that in a few minutes. Okay, so let's think about GCSE. I'm talking about reimagining GCSE. So why do we have GCSE in the first place? GCSE was supposed to be the universal modern foreign languages qualification that all learners could sit and achieve in all settings, comprehensive schools, grammar schools, maintained schools, independent schools, schools of all types, and this would be the end of this elitist system of the O-level and whereby modern languages was the reserve of the kind of academic elite. the figures are fascinating here. So in 1985, in one of the final years of O-level, 147,000 students sat French O-level. More students actually sat French O-level in 1985 than sat French GCSE in 2018. So if the whole idea of GCSE was to make language learning more widespread, it's really failed on its own terms, and I'm not even including there the figures for the CSE qualification, which existed alongside the O-level. I would say, just to be fair, that there is some overlap between the figures for O-level and CSE there, because some students by 1985 did sit both papers. Certainly, the GCSE, in terms of being a universal qualification, is not a success story for modern languages. Often people will say that the reason for the decline in modern languages is that Tony Blair's government, as we'll remember, made languages optional post Key Stage 3, and that this is to blame for a huge decline in the subject. What's quite interesting about that claim is it's true. If we look at the yellow line there, the numbers for taking GCSE languages dropped very, very sharply after 2003. But the A-level line shows us that decline was already well and truly set in. If MFL has been in decline, the decline was slowed down, and the subject was propped up, if you like, by it being compulsory during the 90s. And Tony Blair's policy decision there really allowed GCSE uptake to fall to catch up with A-level uptake in terms of the speed of its decline. There are books such as Eric Hawkins, written in the 1980s, that showed that actually the decline in modern foreign language learning in British schools began way before the 1990s. By the way, this is the story of the post-war age. But certainly this is nothing new of the last 15 to 20 years. Another thing that we say, and I think there is some truth in it, don't get me wrong, is that a reason for the decline of modern languages, perhaps more recently rather than the last 20 years, perhaps more so in the last 5 or 10 years, has been the dominance of STEM subjects, the importance of STEM in school curricula, and the investment that STEM has received, and not least the attention as well. I'm sure there's some truth in that, but the figures, again, are quite interesting. We can see there that despite a focus on STEM, other arts and humanities subjects, for example, history, for example, English, for example, art and design, have fared pretty well, in some cases grown. And it's uniquely modern languages that have really, really suffered during that time. There is nothing absolute about the rule that says that STEM subjects are thriving and non-STEM subjects are struggling. The decline in modern foreign languages has been uniquely bad. What, of course, this slide and the previous slide don't perhaps portray is that the decline there we can see in French I've taken there is far worse actually than it looks, because since 1993, the number of students in the Key Stage 5 curriculum has hugely increased. There are far more students in sixth forms and colleges across the country taking A-levels in the year 2000 than there were in the early 1990s. In the early 1990s, A-levels were still a relatively small cohort of students. But these days, of course, that's not true, and the number of students taking A-levels has greatly increased. So if we were to look at a line on a graph which showed modern foreign language as a proportion of all subjects sat at age 18, then it would be even a steeper a decline, because we are attracting ever fewer of an ever larger proportion of students in Key Stage 5. For me, as a linguist, I think that's a real problem. I think that learning a language is a really valuable and enriching thing. I think it's a good thing for us as a country to be multilingual. I really stand by that, and I think it's a great loss to us as a nation and to us as an educational community to see languages decline at Key Stage 5. And I suspect I'm talking to kindred spirits when I say that. My argument here, my core belief is that while STEM, the focus on STEM, and while Tony Blair's policy decisions have been unhelpful, and while grading perhaps has been unhelpful, I'll come on to severe grading in a second, I think the real cause for decline is to do with content. I think content is biased, I think it's uncompetitive, I think it's static and outdated, and I think our content in our GCSE can be much better and work much harder for us than it does. Just a word on the disparity of grading. I don't really want to get into that debate now. I don't really want to go into the evidence for it now. There are some great reports produced by the ALL and by Ofqual and others on this issue. Ofqual decided, as you'll know, in 2019 that there was an issue with GCSE grading, having previously decided that there was no provable issue with A-level grading, and there will be modest adjustments in French and German GCSE to bring them into line with Spanish. The reason that I don't really want to talk about grading is that the evidence suggests, and you will see it later, that students tend not to base, on a national level, on a cohort level, tend not to base their subject choices on perceptions of difficulty. If they do, it's not the most important characteristic or the most important factor. I also believe that if grading were to be nudged or changed, I fear that wouldn't have a meaningful and sustainable impact on uptake of modern foreign languages at key stages 4 and 5. So that's the reason that I don't want to talk about grading in this video. Okay, let's think first then about content and bias. There is some truth in the fact that modern foreign languages is declining faster in more deprived areas of England, and that shows that there is, or perhaps there might be, a socioeconomic element to the subject's decline. And I think it's because of this, and that in no other subject does a student have to articulate their responses to exam questions in a manner which is so directly mediated through their own personal lived experience. We ask students about them and their lives throughout modern foreign languages GCSE. That's pretty unique, actually, to MFL. We don't ask students to do that in other subjects. We don't ask history students to describe history or to analyze history by means of their favorite antiques, and we don't ask biology students, for example, to talk about ecosystems by referring to their own luxurious gardens. I'm being slightly flippant, but actually when we look at, I'm talking about the mainstream GCSE here, not the IGCSE, if we look at the themes that students study, I think those themes of my family, my hobbies, my holidays, my hometown, my school and my careers, they do risk structurally disadvantaging students with from less affluent backgrounds and students with perhaps more complex or vulnerable lives. Particularly in the holidays topic, I've certainly taught in settings where that topic really falls flat and students very quickly bore of having to imagine a response to a question about holidays. Now, of course, the obvious answer is, well, it doesn't matter if students haven't got a particular hobby, or if their parents aren't in work, or if they don't want to describe their home, they can make it up. Of course, and that's what we all tell our students. But I don't see the point in making it up. I don't think that's consistent with the goals of communicative language teaching. The goal of communicative language teaching was to give students opportunities to use language in natural context. So that's okay, but it's a bit odd. More importantly, though, that places additional cognitive demand on those students who are required to make up their responses. There is no point asking students a realistic question, in my view, of tell me about your last holiday, if the answer we know is going to be unrealistic. It doesn't wash, and we lose credibility with our students, and we alienate them, or certainly some of them. This is from the Independent Schools Council Census 2020. It's not surprising, given the bias that I just mentioned there, that if we look, this is a graph showing A-level entries and the extent to which independent schools are over or underrepresented in A-level entries. And it's no surprise to me that French, German, and Spanish and other modern languages are subjects, in fact Spanish is not on that, yes it is, sorry, Spanish, French and German are subjects in which modern foreign languages are heavily, independent schools, sorry, are heavily overrepresented. So you're almost, there are almost, I think this figure that I read was there are about 14 to 15% of of students in Key Stage 5 are in independent settings, but about 30% of modern foreign languages candidates are from independent schools. And that's not even recognising the fact that some independent schools will sit pre-U examinations rather than A-level. So despite the idea of the GCSE being this would be universal qualification, as I said on one of those earlier slides, fewer people sit French at GCSE than did O-level, and at Key Stage 5, this is a subject in which independent schools are heavily overrepresented. This story came up in the TES last year. A commentator picked out one of the photo cards. This is from the examiner's report. The examiner's report stated that some students struggle to state the advantages and or disadvantages of a skiing holiday. Most responses related to the weather. It's actually quite a shocking sentence when you read it. Well, of course, some students will struggle to state the advantages and or disadvantages of a skiing holiday, especially those perhaps who haven't been on a skiing holiday. And I don't blame them, in fairness, for giving responses that relate to the weather. Those are the obvious things to say if you haven't been on a skiing holiday. But certainly put yourself in the shoes of that student. What does German feel like for you? Does it feel like a subject that's designed for students like you if you're being asked to talk about the pros and cons of skiing holidays? I don't think so, and I think that's a fairly alienating experience. This is some statistics from the BBC, actually, that they originally got from the DFE, and it does show the shape, if you like, of the decline of MFL. On the right there, we've got the names of the local authorities in which MFL has declined most precipitously, and that's just in those 5 particular years, but they tend to be more deprived parts of the country. And the schools where languages are declining most quickly are most likely to have a large proportion of pupils eligible for free school meals, and are most also likely to be in urban areas, often in northern England. So I don't like, as a northerner myself, I don't like that pattern. I don't like to think of modern languages being a pursuit of the wealthier southern English towns. I think that's not a good trend. It's interesting that the National Association for Language Advisors, only in the last few days, so I'm recording this in June, but only at the end of May, the National Association of Language Advisors, not as big an organisation as it once was, has become interested in this issue of bias in the MFL curriculum, and is actually doing some research right now on teachers' experience of delivering the MFL curriculum in the classroom, and the extent to which that has negative implications for disadvantaged learners. So I shall put the link to that survey in the notes below the video, so that you can fill in the survey with your own views if you'd like to. Okay, so I've talked about the problems with curriculum in terms of bias. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the MFL curriculum being one which it's not only biased but actually doesn't compete. I think that it's important for us to offer students a really invigorating experience in any curriculum, particularly in modern foreign languages, a subject which is struggling. And I look at our curriculum and I see the following. I see that topics are repeated again and again and again and again from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 4. Now, in fairness, the national curriculum doesn't tell us to do this. National curriculum gives us a lot of freedom, particularly at Key Stage 3, to do what we like. But when I look at the major textbooks, and when I look at practice in schools, then actually there is a huge amount of repetition, and that's because schools are required by SLTs often to cover GCSE content in Key Stage 3 and to prepare students well for GCSE by covering that material thoroughly throughout the school year. What's also interesting is not only the same topics occur within subjects, but also that the specifications for all the different languages as diverse as French, German, Arabic, Spanish, Mandarin, Russian, Italian, and Polish, are pretty much indistinguishable, apart from the section of the specifications which talk about grammar and language. In terms of what they're learning to say and what they're learning to read, it is pretty much indistinguishable, and they are still writing about futile banalities, I've said there, about their lives in the UK, regardless of what language paper they're sitting. So, and I've got some examples of that to show you in a second. Some of our topics are essentially watered down accounts of our UK lives. So, what do you like to do at the weekend, and tell me about your hometown, and some of the other topics which form a major part of the GCSE are kind of recycled PSHE material, particularly the ones around environment and social issues. This is when they're learning about the environment in French, let's say, what's quite interesting is that they're not really learning about the environment at all. They're learning a simplified version of how to give an account of the language. They're learning what they already know, but less well in French, and it's not really taking them into intellectually into a new place. And we'll all know in the fourth bullet point there that students are required to artificially construct opinions about wholly unremarkable propositions and topics. We ask students for opinions on everything, both in GCSE and IGCSE. And the truth is, some of the things we ask them for opinions on are opinions that they've made up to please the examiner, not because that's what they want to say, which is a very jarring learning experience for students, I would say. And I think there's a slight difficult truth here, or an elephant in the room even, that when students say MFL is too hard or MFL isn't useful, particularly this thing of MFL is too hard, and therefore I'm not picking it so it's too hard, I'm not going to get a grade at the grade that I want. To some extent, I think this is a euphemistic response which masks a complex interplay between all sorts of factors. When students make their subject choices, there are many, many factors at play, including likelihood of success, the level of enjoyment, and the perceived utility. It's not doesn't just boil down to one of those things. If you like, it's a kind of virtuous triangle. It may well be that MFL is too hard, but what I think students are saying there is it's too hard given the lesser level of enjoyment and lesser perceived usefulness. If the level of enjoyment is perceived to be greater and the usefulness is perceived to be greater, then students will accept a greater level of difficulty. So I don't think we can change how hard language learning is. Language learning is it's a challenging thing to do. So to make it worth it, we have to really invest in the level of enjoyment and enrichment that students get out of it. I don't think we can really change the utility of language. We can work on the perception of utility of language, but really the context here is of English as a lingua franca, globalization, and the internet. I don't think utility is the battlefield on which we'll win the debate about subject choices in the marketplace. An undergraduate sent me this message on Twitter. Hi, she said, I completely agree with you. At the ages of 15, 16, students are studying things which seem quite advanced, especially in STEM, but in MFL, they're describing their town. I find that a lot of usually high-achieving students in my year got their lowest grade in MFL because the interest just wasn't there. I think that the curriculum and methods of assessments are equally bad. Well, that's an interesting remark, actually, because in Ofqual's review of grading at A-level in 2018, they essentially said that they reject the idea that there is such thing as severe grading, and they said that if grades are lower in MFL, it's because levels of motivation and the quality of teaching and learning are lower, and that seems to be what this student is saying. There are many reasons why grades can be lower in a subject. It's not necessarily to do with a kind of a pernicious plot about severe grading. Just as a health warning, when I say we need to invest in students' enjoyment of the subject, I'm not about to tell you that I think we should be all jumping up and down on chairs and playing games in every single lesson. That's not what I mean by enjoyment. I mean the kind of academic enjoyment of being in the classroom and studying stimulating material. And you'll see that in a second. There's another message I had on Twitter from the father of a student picking her A-levels. Her GCSE course absolutely killed my daughter's love of Spanish. She will not countenance the subject as an option at A-level. These are just anecdotal, but they give some colour to my my assertion that the curriculum is a problem, and it's perhaps a fundamental problem which sits beneath other discussions about STEM and about grading and about Tony Blair. This was a tweet from actually a student after the 2019 German listening exam, 12th of June. She's tweeted this. She says, imagine spending 5 years learning German to be asked about spaghetti and the Mediterranean Sea. She got 144 likes for that. And one of her friends replied, when did they ask about the Mediterranean Sea? And she laughs. It's a very perceptive and astute comment by a student, and there was actually a question in the German AQA GCSE last year which asked students about spaghetti and the Mediterranean. My point here is, why are we asking students about spaghetti in a German exam? it not only makes the kind of the content culturally neutral, the content the GCSE culturally neutral, and actually it's more than that. It's to some extent culturally displaced. Not that Germans don't eat spaghetti and go to the Mediterranean. They do. They love it, of course. Not wishing for a moment to fill the GCSE with stereotypes, but there was an opportunity lost there for students to learn something about German identities. This is another, Isabelle Despreux, apparently is head of languages at Kilgraston School in Perthshire, Scotland. I'm not looking to really go into the issue of boys versus girls, and I don't like the idea of a gendered curriculum and that we have to kind of include more things about football and cars or tech to engage boys. I don't think I think students see through that. But I do like that penultimate paragraph there. Writing in our school's annual magazine, The Times Paris correspondent Charles Bremner noted that every language expresses a world seen through different eyes. And it's a lovely quote. And I'd like students to experience that at GCSE, and in fact all the way through their language learning experience in schools. I think the fact that they don't reinforces this idea of languages as a pretty bland subject. Malpass in 2014 did some research on why students don't like learning languages, which I'll just share with you. Research over the last 30 years has consistently found that UK students are reluctant to study another language. We know this. MFLs are perceived as irrelevant for future careers and more demanding, repetitive and boring compared to other subjects on the curriculum. Attempts to emphasise the beneficial impact of MFL study on future careers have been counterproductive and tend to lower the status of the subject to that of a workplace skill. However, students that do continue to study in MFL at A-level cite their enjoyment of subject and its relevance to their future life and career. An interesting picture really reported by Malpass, and I think it's and she articulates precisely what I mean when in terms of the euphemism that students imply when they say it's too hard. What students are also saying in her research is that it's repetitive and boring. And if you think about the kind of stuff we ask students to do, it is utter banality. It's a kind of utter nonsense that we ask students to write about and talk about in their GCSE, and they know that. And in fact, Malpass isn't the only person to have looked at content as a problem as a motivational problem within modern foreign languages. Williams, back in 1986, said, "In the absence of interest, very little is possible." So if students are reading texts, for example, which have no interest to them, motivating them and getting them to learn is very, very challenging. Coyle found the curriculum in his work with students to be irrelevant, reductive, and held back by low cognitive demands, so quite the opposite of being too difficult. Cuff, his work showed that student choices are driven by enjoyment and perceived usefulness, and less so by perceptions of difficulty. This is confirmed in 2017, and Ipsos MORI research and with JCQ also found that students find MFL content disengaging. There is a pattern here, and I think that they're onto something. Milton in 2011 did some interesting research looking at, he didn't name the textbook, but he looks at a leading textbook, and his research is actually about the acquisition of vocabulary and the extent to which students are making good progress in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. And he finds, interestingly, that the students make quite good progress in Year 7, but that if they learn on average about 350 words in Year 7, in his study, students' learning decelerated hugely in Year 8 and Year 9, because if you measure it in terms of the number of words that they can understand on a standardized test, so they tended to acquire only about 60 to 100 words compared to 300 in Years 8 and 9. There's a real kind of sense of progress slowing down, and he attributes that in this paper to aspects of teaching materials that we use in the UK. Firstly, he says that we introduce too few words, and secondly, he interestingly says that we introduce too many high-frequency words and not a good enough balance of high-frequency and low-frequency vocabulary, which is an interesting proposition. There's a sort of assumption, certainly one that I bought into, which was that to communicate with any sense of automaticity or fluency, you need lots and lots of high-frequency words. But his argument is actually that that to have any sense of confidence and fluency, you need a good balance of low-frequency words as well to fill in the gaps in your sentences. I don't want to go into that debate now, but he did he did identify in an academic context what I've been saying in this presentation about the sameness of topics and the sameness of students' experience in MFL. He said the content of the 3 books over the 3 years is very similar. The same topics are tackled again and again and again, but limiting infrequent vocabulary in this way was failing to provide the thematic variety that must make the course dull. A dull course book will lead to demotivated learners. This may explain very low uptake levels among learners studying the textbook. Again, I don't know, obviously there is variety between textbooks, but whether you're studying with Tricolor or the Cambridge IGCSE book or Studio or Dynamo, whatever textbook you're using, I think we can safely say that they all talk about the same thing. They all cover the same topics, more or less. Some of them have a slightly more French flavor to them than others, or Spanish or German if you're teaching other languages. But broadly speaking, there are no textbooks out there which really take students on a significantly different journey through Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. I'll just turn the camera off, which I can't do. That graph, there are the figures, if you like, showing the vocabulary acquisition over those years, just for interest. So you can see in year 1, students had an average of 311 words. In year 2, which is year 8, 411. In year 3, year 9, they had only acquired an extra 49 words. So really, the slowdown really is spectacular in year 9. Let's just turn to the commentariat and what some commentators say about the MFL curriculum. Prospect magazine wrote in 2019, this was around the time of various stories coming out about the decline of MFL that was led in a feature by the BBC and Bramwell Jeffries. They said, as part of this, school languages curricula needs to become more enticing. Really, Prospect magazine noting that it's pretty tedious what we do in MFL lessons, and if we want to engage students in language learning as part of our multi-day national strategy, then changing content or enhancing content is part of the idea. The following letter, which I'm about to show on the screen, came from a reader to The Guardian, and this came after the government's announcement in 2019 that they would be nudging grading in French and German to match that of Spanish and try and address the so-called severe grading issue. This contributor wrote a very powerful letter, I think you'll agree. It's not simply, wrote Peregrine Rand of Godalming in Surrey, the harshness of the marking in published examinations that causes language learners difficulties, but also the perverse pernicketiness of many of the tasks pupils are required to undertake. Pernicketiness that many native speakers of language find bizarre and difficult to navigate. More depressing, he goes on, however, is the crashing banality of the content of most of the language courses offered in schools. In their desperate and misguided pursuit of what young people find relevant and exciting, shackled to the requirement to deliver government's eye-rollingly tedious program for healthy, upright living, the writers of exam board specifications have also emptied the courses of any engaging intellectual content and any requirement that students truly engage with the culture of the countries whose languages they are learning. The real surprise is that any pupils at all continue to choose with a modern language at school beyond the point to which it's compulsory. Peregrine Rand there articulating much more with much greater clarity what I'm trying to say in this video, I think. So thanks, Peregrine. A collection of AQA GCSE questions here, and I picked on AQA. I don't know why I'm being so mean in AQA. This could have been the Pearson qualifications. It could have been CIE, perhaps. They're all much of a muchness, and that's because they all work to the same criteria. So I'm not being mean in AQA. I'm saying AQA there just to be clear about where this has come from. Let's look at these tasks that students do in a GCSE. Vous décrivez vos vacances pour votre blog. Vous écrivez un blog sur l'argent et le shopping. Vous décrivez vos rapports avec les autres pour un magazine français. You're doing some research about volunteering in Quebec and find this podcast. Vous parlez avec un employé dans un studio de télévision en Belgique. Moi, je suis l'employé. These are all the so-called kind of realistic and plausible scenarios that we give students to do their work in their GCSE exams. And I'm sure you predicted what I'm going to say. They're all absolutely farcical. No young person ever has done any of these things. Students don't post forum comments about their favorite sports. They don't write magazine articles in school magazines about the environment in each other's schools. They don't write blogs about whether they prefer living in the town or the countryside. They book restaurants online. They don't. I really don't get the one about booking places to watch a TV program at a TV studio. That's a really niche concern. And I think you can't see there, it's hidden by the video. Performing basic transactional tasks in a target language defies students' lived experience of visiting those countries if they're those lucky students who've had the ability to travel. Particularly as I'm a German teacher, I know that my students, those who have been to Germany, will know that if they do want to order a currywurst, they will be responded to in English. And I'm not trying to say here that we have an entitlement to linguistic hegemony. It's more that the idea that you need German to get by, or that you need Spanish to be able to travel, it's not very convincing. Of course, you have a much more fulfilling experience if you can do transactional tasks in German or in Spanish or in French or whatever, but it's not that you need it. Saying that you need it is disingenuous and not convincing. Of course, that might change, and I really am at pains to emphasise that I don't applaud English attitudes to monolingualism, and I don't think that we should be able to march all over the world and speak our mother tongue just because we speak the lingua franca. Not at all. But I think that add a focus on basic transactional tasks and communicative tasks at the expense of all else is problematic. And these chosen examples, I think, also remind us that that GCSE, as it's evolved slightly since the late 1980s, has kind of always tried to update itself and remain current and relevant to kind of the way students live their lives. Of course, it's backfiring. So these slightly regrettable attempts to sort of update itself by talking about blogs and forums, really undermine the learning rather than enhance the learning, I think, and that was reflected in Peregrine Rand's comments. So often we'll hear teachers saying, MFL needs to be more modern. We need to really focus it on practical communication and kind of bring it in, take it out of the kind of grammar cupboard and put it onto a more realistic modern footing. Let's look at a text which describes that. The main feature of nearly all language developments which have taken place in recent years in foreign language learning and teaching is a shift in emphasis towards everyday communication. The changing nature of foreign language learning is well documented in newly published course books and by statements made in official reports appearing in recent years. The Foreign Language Working Group, set up by the Assessment and Performance Unit to suggest guidelines for the tests to be used in a monitoring program, was expressing a consensus, therefore, in claiming that communication is the prime purpose of learning a foreign language. The belief is now widespread among teachers in schools and is associated with a concern to relate the language learning of young people to their own experience. It has led many teachers to give more prominence in the early years of learning to the practical activities of speaking and showing understanding of the foreign language, and at the same time to question the effectiveness of methods which give excessive attention to form and grammatical accuracy. In the communicative approach, it is intended that learners build up their vocabulary, structure, and grammar in the process of learning the foreign language. They begin to understand the language forms to which they are introduced because these acquire meaning when used in purposeful activities. Now, this, of course, was written over 35 years ago. My point here is that the shift to communicative language teaching, I'm not rejecting that. I'm not saying we should be going back to an O-level curriculum and sitting there learning grammar for 5 years. Absolutely not. But there is nothing modern anymore. There is nothing new, or there is nothing bold anymore about suggesting that the purpose of language teaching should be to enable everyday communication. That was what the idea was in 1980. They had this idea that languages should be about enabling everyday communication, and this would be the prime purpose of foreign language learning. And to say that that should be the case now is not to be bold or adventurous. It's actually to rehash something that was the kind of the new thinking 35 years ago. It's not 40 years ago if the DES was talking about this in 1980. So there's nothing new anymore about practical communication as our language learning goal. Does the GCSE produce great linguists, though? Many people listening to this might have taught GCSE before the current GCSE, so in the days of controlled assessment. And the new GCSE was certainly designed to kind of correct the problems that were there with its predecessor and control assessment. So there was a sense that students were no longer able to speak and write spontaneously and of their own accord. They just got used to learning things parrot fashion, and the new GCSE was designed to address that. Many independent schools, meanwhile, switched to IGCSE because of this already, and were therefore never in the situation that some of those schools who'd done the previous GCSE found themselves in. So if we're saying that the purpose of the GCSE, the justification for GCSE, is that it does produce good communicative linguists, and that's the point. Well, what does the evidence say about that? I'm going to look at the AQA Examiner's Report from 2019 for French. This is the highest tier specification. There were some really impressive and spontaneous conversations from the highest achieving students. It says, well, that sounds good. It sounds like GCSE is achieving its goal, but most relied heavily on pre-learned material. In the case of some students, there was an imbalance between their exploration of the nominated theme and that of the second theme in terms of quality of communication. So my point here is that if we justify GCSE on the basis that it does help us create good linguists who can communicate freely, well, then that justification falls flat, because the examiners themselves are saying that most students rely on parrot-learned material, things they've learned off by heart. What else do they say in their reports? Question 1.1, as in foundation tier, they say some students did not recognize a time marker hier and therefore did not refer to past activities which impacted on their tasks. This doesn't sound like an exam in which students, or a system or qualification in which students have become communicatively competent. Sections 8 and 9 proved to be the most challenging, with il me faudra and travailler à l'étranger causing difficulties. This is not just difficulties for the weaker students. This is the examiner's report talking about widespread difficulties encountered in the exam. I would expect a student to be able to cope with travailler à l'étranger in the GCSE exam, particularly given that we're talking about modern languages, and therefore we might be talking about l'étranger, places overseas. Students commonly try to express their ideas in continuous present, reflecting English usage, ils sont mangeants, or ils sont mangés, as opposed to ils mangent. Again, if the GCSE was succeeding in its goal to produce kind of a generation of communicatively competent linguists, then this wouldn't be happening. You can't see this quote, but it talks about inaccurate verb formations and continue to impede communication, as well as a lack of core or key vocabulary. So if the whole idea behind GCSE was that we just should be able to kind of chat and say something and get our point across in everyday communicative situations, it isn't working according to the examiners. Let's think a little bit about what we are telling students, perhaps subconsciously, about the purpose of modern foreign languages through our curriculum. The GCSE, as we've seen, constructs various kind of contrived real-life scenarios in which they need to communicate. So role plays to book hotel rooms, writing blogs for school websites and youth magazines, and reading blogs and youth forums. In framing the subject in this way, in the way that all questions have this kind of sense of application to them, we reinforce the idea that MFL has uniquely utilitarian value. We then also reinforce this by constantly referring to the value of MFL in careers in some of the communications that come from government, from the associations, and even from ourselves, including myself as a teacher. This does, however, contradict their kind of personal lived experience, where they'll know plenty of people who've done really well in life without speaking a language, and certainly without speaking it every day. And they will also have found that they can do lots of these tasks of functional communication without speaking a foreign language. Meanwhile, though, I'm not really got a problem with students learning to communicate in a foreign language. I want them to do that, and I want them to be able to buy an ice cream and book a restaurant. That's fine. I don't want that to be the main purpose of their GCSE. But by focusing too much on that kind of utilitarian aspect of GCSE and giving them too many utilitarian platforms for using the language, I think that the many other reasons and the many other purposes for language learning remain really invisible to secondary students. So as linguists, we know that, yes, we learn a language and we become able to communicate in that language, but we also become very culturally engaged in a critical way. We gain huge amounts of social capital. We know that language learning has cognitive benefits. We know it has academic prowess. We know it's hugely enriching, etc., etc., etc. I think that a lot of that is invisible to students who are just studying the typical kind of Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 GCSE diet, because the GCSE gives no space for the things in that fourth bullet point there. The national curriculum actually has some quite nice words to describe the purpose of study for modern languages. It describes the purpose of study for modern languages as a liberation from insularity and provides an opening to other cultures. A high-quality languages education should foster pupils' curiosity and deepen their understanding of the world. That is what we seek to achieve in the national curriculum. This is the Key Stage 3 national curriculum. I really like those words. I think for me that is why I'm a linguist. That is why I teach languages. Curiously, though, again talking about the mainstream GCSE here, out of the 240 marks available, not a single mark is actually awarded for students demonstrating the cultural curiosity or understanding of the wider world that the national curriculum itself articulates. The national curriculum says that this is why we have modern languages, but then we don't assess whether students have attained or achieved that in our exams. And I think also modern languages is perhaps not the only, but one of the few subjects where there is such change or such inconsistency between what's expected at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 and beyond. At Key Stage 5 and undergraduate levels in modern languages, we're very comfortable with the idea that responding to cultural ideas or situating our responses in the social and cultural context of the target language is a very natural thing to do, but it's completely missing at GCSE. And there's no, if a student is studying GCSE German, for example, there is no, we can excuse them for not knowing that if you study German at Key Stage 5 or undergraduate level, that actually what you're assessed in changes quite a lot. It morphs into not just being able to use German. We don't just assess you on the language. We also assess you on their critical cultural engagement. Undergraduate level, that kind of critical cultural insight is worth half the marks. That is very inconsistent. There's no reason why why it's so prominent at undergraduate and completely absent at Key Stage 4. I can see there might be a gradation, but the complete absence of Key Stage 4 for me is unjustified. So if we accept this as what the purpose of language learning is, in the words of the national curriculum, let's see how this then plays out in an actual GCSE question. I've picked a German one this time. Deine Freundin Eva aus Österreich geht gern zu Live-Events. Schreib Eva eine E-Mail über Live-Events. I need to tell Eva about an event that I was at and compare this event with the TV. I can't see how this question enables us to determine whether students have achieved the learning outcome as articulated in the national curriculum. I think it's absolute nonsense, garbage. The same question could have, of course, occurred in any of the other languages, French, Spanish, or Arabic, etc., etc. To prove that point, I'm just going to show you a question here about the environment. We have to listen to a passage about someone talking about the environment. And we have to say what damage people do to the land according to Enas, what damage has been done to the sea, what things Sarmad says, what he blames for damage to the environment, and in Sarmad's view, what causes particular harm to health. This question could have been in French, could have been in German, Italian, Spanish, Russian, Mandarin Chinese. In fact, it was in Arabic, and this is the Arabic writing question, which is remarkably similar to the German one we just had about going to a live event. This one is about going to a sports event, and I have to do a similar sort of thing. How did I hear about it? What did I think of it? What's my favorite sport, etc. There is nothing kind of redolent of the Arab world in these questions. It's just the same old kind of neutral content played back in whatever language the exam happens to be in. And for me, learning modern languages, it's about so much more than just taking a familiar idea and inserting foreign words. It's about being able to have and access different ideas and different imaginations in the first place. That's not the experience, though, that GCSE gives our students. Just wanted to look at some of the translations. Now, translations is one of the things that was most proudly announced about the new GCSE. Bringing back translation, that's good. Proper language learning now. Getting back to translation, oh, that's all good. All right, fine. So let's look at the translations that students do. Again, this is AQA, but there's a Pearson one coming up now. So, what do students have to translate? To celebrate my birthday, I invited my friends to my house. My mother prepared a special meal. I received a computer. It is useful because I have a lot of homework. Next year in September, I will do an apprenticeship in a college in the town centre, and I would like good results. Alternatively, last Saturday I did my homework and some recycling. Then I spent the afternoon in the countryside with my grandmother. We ate in a small cafe. I forgot my mobile. Yeah, right. So it was a bit boring in my opinion. Next weekend I would like to go to the sports centre as I want to stay fit. These passages are just gobsmackingly dreadful. They are full of non sequiturs. They don't really make any sense. Of course, they sort of do make sense on one level, but they don't make sense as anything that anyone would have ever written. They're not remotely authentic or natural pieces of writing. They're also stilted in their own use of English. No one says I received a computer, for example. They're also just poor examples of how language can and should be used. They are unclear in their intent. So what does, for example, it mean to say, I did some recycling? What does that actually mean, to do some recycling? Does that mean that you put some things in the bin? Does that mean you empty your bin and sort things out? Does that mean you go to what used to be called the bottle bank? Well, they don't exist anymore because everyone's recycling happens at home. If we are saying to students that we are languages, right? We are a language subject. This, by the way, is the hardest question. This is the final question in the higher writing paper, this translation. This is the bit that only the grade 9 students will do really, really well in. Yet look at the quality of them. We're saying we're languages, and then we're giving them these kind of rubbish texts as examples of what language does. That's a pretty underwhelming and a pretty unimpressive outcome for GCSE students. I don't think we can really hand on heart say that we are advocates for all that languages is for all that languages is, and for all the reasons that languages are rich and exciting. If that's what we're expecting, that's what we want students to achieve. No student's going to be particularly proud of themselves being able to write something that they know is nonsensical. This is one from the Arabic. Nadia lives in Tunisia and we call each other every day. She doesn't like school, she finds geography difficult, but she's good at languages. However, for her they're both important as she wants to travel and get a good job when she's older. She thinks that by working she can succeed. These are all completely kind of neutral, anodyne, banal texts. I don't think they give a sense at all of the excitement that language learning should mean. In the previous slide, I showed you an excerpt from National Curriculum at Key Stage 3 and then was comparing that with GCSE, but I just wanted to show you what the equivalent documents say for Key Stage 4. And the equivalent document for Key Stage 4 is really the DFE subject content criteria for modern foreign languages. And on its first page, it talks about the outcomes that students should achieve through modern languages. So alongside there at the top, you've got developing ability to communicate confidently, expressing and developing thoughts and ideas spontaneously, listening and understanding, standard speech, etc., etc. If you look further down, though, the GCSE criteria actually says that students should develop awareness and understanding of the culture and identity of the countries and communities where the language is spoken. This is quite interesting because this is the criteria by which Ofqual determine whether exam board specifications are adequate or not. And Ofqual appear to have overlooked this need for students to develop awareness and understanding of culture, because in the GCSE there is no means at present of testing whether students have indeed achieved that, which is a slight oversight in my view by Ofqual. So there it is. We've got it at Key Stage 3. We've got it at Key Stage 4. Key Stage 5, those of you who know will know that one of the assessment objectives talks about cultural knowledge, and students have to talk about the book and the film, and they have to situate their answers to questions about the topics in the target language culture. So we know about that at Key Stage 4. But also this is a QCAA talking about expectations for language programs at undergraduate level. The acquisition of proficiency in languages has 4 complementary aims, which virtually all courses in languages endeavour to integrate. And sort of the first bullet point there for university courses is that students should acquire a medium of understanding, i.e. linguistic acquisition. The second one, to gain access to other societies and cultures, being able to live and work in other countries with people from elsewhere. This is described as its cultural awareness. understanding and competence. And finally, the fourth bullet point, to gain access to various bodies of knowledge that are available in the language concerned, and to methodological approaches that have been developed in other countries. This has been described as knowledge of the culture and societies where the language is used. So at Key Stage 3, 4, and undergraduate level, we have very clear articulation in the official guidance about what the purpose of language learning is, and it's also there at Key Stage 5. It's just not on my slide, but it's suspiciously absent from what students actually do in their exams, and therefore it's often absent from the classroom. Why do we teach MFL then? And this really comes back to my first slide where I had that kind of hierarchy of outcomes, assessment, curriculum, and pedagogy. And I've said earlier in the presentation that our GCSE exams tell students that language learning is a utilitarian thing, and that's not how other subjects present themselves nor sell themselves. We're in a problem here. If we continue in this fashion, we're in my view, really signing ourselves up to another decade or 2 decades of decline. Because the truth is, the elephant in the room is that English as a lingua franca is consolidating itself. It's becoming more and more widespread, and that technology to aid translanguaging, so translation technology, is ever stronger and actually pretty good. So if we continue to make the case for modern languages on utilitarian grounds, and if we continue to deliver modern languages in a utilitarian way that is all about kind of basic communication and functional communication, then the case for MFL in schools is less compelling every single day. So that's my problem, if you like, with MFL provision, universal MFL provision in the UK. I don't think it's convincing anymore. I think the world has changed. So what might better MFL provision look like? I think there are 4 key tests for what better MFL provision might look like. Firstly, it should be fair. We should assess students on content which has been taught in the classroom, not lived outside the classroom. That puts it in line with other subjects and means that every student, whatever background they're from, has equal chances to success, all other things being equal. So we should not ask students to talk about their their holidays and their hobbies in their exams. It should be on content which all students have been invited to study within the classroom. I think that content should be culturally and socially situated. I think that the vocabulary we learn and the tasks that we do and the text that we read and the films that we watch and the text that we listen to in the exam and in our lessons should be absolutely smack of the cultures and countries where the language is spoken. I don't think it makes any sense to talk about our own hometown in the West Midlands in French. We might as well be talking about and learning about the French-speaking world if we're talking about local environments, which should take account of the changes in context since 1987. Like it or not, I'm not going to go into this debate. We're no longer members of the European Union. The idea that British citizens would be freely travelling to different parts of Europe and speaking different languages as part of a normal part of their careers, A, turned out not to be true, as true for English speakers as it was for speakers of other languages coming to Britain, and B, English is not only the kind of the dominant European language, it's the dominant global language more so than in 1987, and C, the speed with which translation technology has developed is really impressive, and some of the things which we were required to do in 1987 by being functionally communicative are no longer as important because we have access to different kinds of things. I think I see Google Translate and that sort of tool as the equivalent of calculators in maths. There's no point pretending they don't exist. They do exist. Let's take account of that and walk towards that issue, not run away from it. And I think that universal MFL provision should be ambitious enough to secure progress and eliminate excess repetition of content. That means that if we've covered the hobbies topic in year 7 and year 8, we don't need to be doing it again in year 9 and year 10, and therefore we perhaps don't even need to assess it in the GCSE. We can do other things. What I would really like to see is a new GCSE with balanced learning goals that actually replicate or reflect the outcomes that are already articulated in the Key Stage 3 national curriculum, in the Key Stage 4 subject content criteria, in the Key Stage 5 criteria, and in the guidelines for undergraduate study. So I think a GCSE, of course, should still be about communication. We should still expect students to be able to apply their learning of the modern language and say something and write something. But I also think we should be assessing students in their linguistic skill. I think this incentivizes good teaching of languages and should be giving students credit for method and process, not just the application of their linguistic skill. Again, that puts it in line with other subjects where, if you like, you get marks for your working out, not just marks for your final answer, whereas in modern languages you kind of only get marks for your final answer, your ability to write it, say it, or understand it. And finally, we should be incorporating some element of critical cultural engagement in our GCSE. Now, whether that's by means of doing a little piece of writing about a film that you've watched in the target language, or whether you do some of that in English, or whether some of it's commentary, or whatever it is, that's really the exciting conversation, and that's up for debate. But I do think that enables us to eliminate some of the class bias in the curriculum, and enables students to do some of their language tasks relating to the content that is studied in the classroom. And it's also a much more natural thing to write and talk and read and listen in French if what I'm communicating about is a film or a text. I mean text in the broadest possible sense that is situated already in the target language. Is this a new debate? Am I kind of onto something new here? Am I a pioneer? Absolutely not. The debate about what language learning constitutes is as old as language learning itself. And interestingly, our current orthodoxy around the kind of exclusive focus on communication and GCSE is quite recent and quite anomalous. Hawkins wrote a lot on this in the 1980s, and so have others. Shirley Laws, though, of UCL, wrote this text in 2018. The list of possible examples of how cultural content can be restored to the subject discipline is endless. Pedagogical issues can be resolved if there is a genuine belief in the capacity of all young people to be inspired by the best which has been thought and said, to quote Matthew Arnold in 1869. By introducing young people to the culture of the foreign language through the greatest and most creative works that society or an individual has achieved, we can encourage them to see that there is more to the foreign language than the functional and sometimes banal representations they normally experience. To restore the cultural content alongside the linguistic content of foreign languages is to restore the status and value of the subject discipline within the school curriculum. In this way, learners of foreign languages move beyond their parochial subjective experiences to appreciate cultural achievements that have spread beyond national boundaries and are part of universal human culture. I agree with what Shirley says there, all the more so because the case for communicative language teaching and communicative language goals is weaker every day. The more that English establishes itself as a lingua franca, and the more that technology advances upon us. This just is a nice representation of the French approach to langue vivante at collège. It has this kind of real sense of un programme culturel and un programme linguistique. And I think I invite you to Google this. I think it's the troisième ou quatrième cycle, I can't remember. The way in which the language learning in the French system is kind of always situated in the imagination of the target language. And I'm not saying that the French get everything right in terms of modern languages. I'm not saying they teach better. I'm just saying that they have a nice way of, a nice framework for thinking about what the curriculum looks like. So, in summary, for me, what is the case for change in MFL? I think we need to think about the purpose of modern foreign languages. Our Year 7s in 2020 will be going into the workforce in 2027. What is the experience that students need at schools that only MFL can deliver to make them successful, ambitious, go-getting employees and citizens? And for me, it's probably about critical engagement with other cultures and global citizenship, not just about functional communication. It's also being about being good, confident users of English, and linguistics education is a really important part of that. Curriculum, I fundamentally believe that until we have a curriculum which inspires and competes, and a curriculum which gives students a flavour early on of what Key Stage 5 an undergraduate study looks like and feels like, then we will be fighting a losing battle in terms of recruitment to the subject. Subject choice is a marketplace, and the value proposition for MFL is that currently it is difficult and it's not enjoyable or useful enough to justify that difficulty. We can't change the difficulty. I don't think we should change difficulty, so we should therefore invest in the quality of the experience that students have. And we can't afford for it to be just a subject which appeals to kind of middle-class families. Assessment styles are too numerous, too difficult, and too convoluted. That needs to change. It needs to be brought into the 21st century. I don't think there is such a thing as good or bad teaching. I just think our teaching depends on what we're trying to do in the curriculum and what we're trying to achieve in the classroom. I hope this has been thought-provoking. I hope it provokes lots of discussion for us to have at a future date. And thank you so much for listening.